anybody willing to admit that you saw where we finished up last week and that you read ahead the next few verses in Luke and thought, oh great, the preacher's going to talk about money. Anybody going to admit to that? Or maybe there's some people that saw that and said, I've got stuff I got to do next Sunday morning. Yes, we're going to talk about money. Now that is one of the nice things, I will just be honest, one of the nice things of just taking a book of the Bible and just preaching through that book of the Bible is that when you come across a passage that's talking about money or something else that you maybe don't really want to talk about that much, folks, if you're going to get mad at me that I'm preaching about money today, this is what I'll say to you. Take it up with Luke. He wrote it. Take it up with Jesus. He said it. So, yes, we're going to talk about money. Now, you see that picture up here? I read this story. A mother wanted to teach her daughter a moral lesson. And so she gave her daughter before church. She gave her a quarter and $1. And she said to him, put whichever one you want in the collection plate and keep the other for yourself. Well, while they were coming out of church, the mother decided to ask her daughter which one she had given. Had she given a quarter or had she given $1? The little girl's answer was awesome. Well, I was going to give the $1, but just before the collection, the man in the pulpit said that we should all be cheerful givers. I knew I'd be a lot more cheerful if I gave the quarter. There's probably some of you that have felt that. Have you ever changed the amount you plan to give because of that thought? And I will tell you, there have been some times in our lives. There have been some times where Denise and I have discussed about our giving, and we said, there have been some times where we tithe to the church, not because of the best reason we're going to talk about today, but because of some other reasons. There were some times that we wrote our tithe check kind of out of obligation. There were some times we would write that check because we just knew that we were supposed to, and we weren't very excited about giving it. It's really kind of bad when you're the preacher and you're not all that excited about giving to the church, but we made it through it. But there were some times where we did that, but we went ahead and gave. And honestly, I think that God blessed it, not as much as He wanted to, but He blessed the fact that we were obedient. And I'm not going to talk about giving out of obedience today, but that is a reason that we give. And it's a good reason, but it doesn't rise up to that level that I think makes God look down and really just put a smile on His face and say, yes, that one's mine. And I believe that we can, out of our giving, I believe that we can make God look down on us and smile and say, that one's mine. If you got a Bible, I'm going to ask you to turn to Luke chapter 21. It's a very familiar verse. If you went to Sunday school as a little child, I am sure you read and studied this story many times. Luke chapter 21, starting in verse 1. As Jesus looked up, He saw the rich putting their gifts into the temple treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 very small copper coins. Truly I tell you, He said, this poor widow has put in more than all the others. All these people gave their gifts out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on. We're going to look at 4 reasons to give today. 3 of these reasons, I'm going to tell you, they're not necessarily bad. Now, there definitely can be some very negative things associated with them. But I don't think that any of the 3 reasons we're going to talk about first, they're not necessarily bad. They're just not complete. They're not where we ought to be. And so you may be at a point in your life where you're giving for one of these 3 reasons. And don't walk out of here today and say, well, if I'm not giving for the best reason, I shouldn't give anything. Because that's not the lesson I want you to give, or the reason I want you to learn. What I want you to understand is that sometimes we go through other phases in our life to get to where we need to be. And part of it sometimes is just being obedient to what we're supposed to do until that act of obedience becomes an act of devotion. And so as we talk through these first 3 reasons, don't turn your mind off of, well, those are always bad. because there are some good. The first one I want to talk about is giving to get recognition. Giving to get recognition. Now, I read a story about Charles Spurgeon, and here's the opposite of somebody who gave to get recognition. Charles Spurgeon and his wife, according to a story in a magazine called the Chaplain Magazine, would sell, but refused to give away the eggs that their chickens laid. Even close relatives were told, "You may have them if you pay for them." As a result, some people labeled the Spurgeons greedy and grasping. The Spurgeons accepted this criticism, never defending themselves. And it was only after Mrs. Spurgeon died that the full story was revealed. All of the profits from the sale of eggs went to support 2 elderly widows. Because the Spurgeons were unwilling to, as Matthew says, let their left hand know what the right hand was doing, they endured the attacks in silence. But everything they made from selling those eggs went to support 2 elderly widows. In the story that we read today, giving for recognition was a primary reason that many gave. The treasury that Jesus refers to here were a number of large trumpet-shaped metal cylinders that were located in the temple courtyard. And it was something that everybody who was there could see. And the temple courtyard was a very busy place, and so you would have these large receptacles, and people would come and they would bring their money. And as they would give their money, they would pour their money into these receptacles. Well, if you can just imagine metal coins falling into a metal receptacle, it's going to make noise. And the longer you pour out, everybody is going to start looking. They hear this clink, 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 and it keeps going without stopping. Pretty soon people are going to start looking up going, "Who's that? Who's giving?" Well, some of the people that came, they wanted recognition. They wanted people to know that they were giving. And so they would take and, not just dump it in, they would dump it from here. And I want to tell you, this is where you're getting wrong. When instead of dumping from here, and there's a little bit of noise and you get it out quick, you're dumping from up here and you're making sure that it's even louder and you're hitting the sides of the receptacles. There's a point where giving to get recognition definitely goes beyond the line, and it is wrong. But I think there's some times where we give and we want people to recognize that we gave. And then sometimes, again, it's not bad. It's not evil. It's just not the best. Anybody that was giving would be seen, and they would be recognized. In schools all over our nation today, colleges especially, you walk up to a building and there's a name plastered on the building. And sometimes those names have great meaning. Where I went to college, the football field is named after an Aggie that gave his life fighting for our country. It's got a special meaning. But there are also other buildings at A&M that the only meaning they have is that the guy had a bigger checkbook than anybody else and wrote a bigger check than anybody else, and so he got to put his name up on the building. Is it okay to name a building after somebody? Yes, it is. You're recognizing it's part of the process. And some of those buildings at North Texas, at TWU, and many other schools, those buildings wouldn't be there if people had not written a check and given money so that the buildings could be built. And it's okay to recognize that. But folks, if the only reason you are giving is so that other people will see it, then it's wrong. It's okay hoping that, I give and hoping that some people will see it and they'll recognize and they'll think good of us. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. It just doesn't hit the best reason. The reward is temporary. Because eventually those buildings that have the names of donors on them, eventually those buildings are going to get torn down. And somebody else is going to write a bigger check than you did, and they're going to get their name on the building. The reward is temporary. Another reason that we give sometimes is to feel good. Sometimes it does feel good to give. Knowing that you're giving to a good cause. It brings a good, positive feeling. And there have been many times that I've given to various charities throughout my life that I did because I liked what they were doing. And I didn't feel any special compulsion from God to give to that organization. But I liked what they did, and it made me feel good to be able to give something to help their cause. When I was in Renton, I was involved in a deal called the Communities and Schools of Renton. I volunteered for them. I mentored in the public school for most of my 12 years in Renton. And I love the work that this school did, or this organization did. It was the #1 dropout prevention organization in the U.S. They have a proven track record of doing good. And so when I would give, not much, but when I would give to that organization, I felt good because I could look and say, you know what? Here's an organization that is doing something positive. And it felt good to give. And made you want to give again the next year. Giving because it makes you feel good, that's an okay reason. If you're at that point, maybe you're at your point in giving to anything, much less to God's causes. If you're at a point where you're just feeling because it makes you feel good, then I would say to you, that's awesome. But let's see if you can take the next step. Let's see if you can get to the point beyond feeling because, or giving just because it feels good. The third reason is giving out of abundance. Now, I will admit that I have never found myself in a situation in which I just had too much money and needed to give some away. I would love to have that opportunity one of these days, to be just so rich that I have bought everything that I wanted to buy and that I have had every experience that I want to experience and look at my checkbook and just have too many zeros at the end. I would love that experience. I kind of doubt that's ever going to happen unless we strike oil under our house, which I don't think will happen even then. But I've never been there. I don't know, maybe some of you have been there where you just have so much money that you just look and you go, I just got to give some away. Well, if you do, we'll always take it. But from what Jesus says, that there were people in this story that were giving out of the abundance. Now, while I said I have never had so much money that I just had to give some away, the reality is this, folks. I've never given to the extent that my kids went hungry and bills went unpaid. I've never given to the extent where I had to sell a car. I've never given to the extent where it really hurt to write a check. And probably nobody sitting in this room has either. Everything we give, most likely, is out of our abundance. But there are not many of us that, when we write a check and we drop it in the offering plate on Sunday morning, there are not many of us that look at that and say, there goes lunch this week. Not many of us look at that and say, there goes my house payment. The reality is that every one of us, when we give, we're giving out of abundance. And it's okay to give out of the abundance. But God asks for more. And the fourth reason is the one I want us to really focus on. This elderly widow, Jesus says to her, or says about her, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all the others. All these people gave their gifts out of their wealth, out of their abundance. But she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live with. Jesus says that the reason this woman gives is the reason that is pure. There's no rust on this reason. There's nothing that has to be cleaned off. There's nothing that has to be purified by fire. The reason that this lady gives is the reason that every one of us ought to give. And why does she give? It's out of devotion. Now, the amount that she gives, Jesus says that she has put in more than everybody else. I am sure the disciples looked and said, Jesus has gone crazy. Because they had heard those other guys putting all the money in. And they had heard how much clinking went on when they poured their offerings in. And they knew that this lady gave 2 little copper coins. What was it? Probably about 2 cents. She gives next to nothing. And I know they're thinking, Jesus, that doesn't make any sense. Those other guys gave a whole lot more money. They don't understand what Jesus is saying. When Jesus says that she gave more, he says she gave her all. That she gave everything that she was. And her gift was powerful. It was powerful in the eyes of God because it was everything she had. God looked at her gift and he said, here is a person who has given out of absolute pure devotion and love for me. That she was willing to give anything and everything simply because she looks at her God and says, my God is amazing. My God is a God of love. My God has protected me. And even though I am giving everything I have and I'm not going to have money to go buy lunch for this week, I'm going to give it because my God has given so much more back to me. The gift was powerful because she would go hungry. The gift was powerful because she gave herself. You know, folks, for most of us, it's pretty easy when it comes Sunday morning to write a check, to write in an amount, to sign it, stick it in our envelope, and when the offering plate goes by, to put it in. And God looks at that and says, thank you. God recognizes our giving. And I think God says that is wonderful. But I wonder how many times God looks at our giving and says, I want so much more. And folks, sometimes I think God is saying, I want so much more. He's saying, I don't necessarily want more of your checkbook. I think sometimes God is saying, I want more of your time. Because how many of us would say that it is easier to write a check? When Ryan talks about the youth going on a mission trip, how many of us would say it is easier to write a check to pay for another teenager to go on the trip than to come to Ryan and say, Ryan, I will go? So many of you would say, yeah, it's a whole lot easier to write a check and pay for another adult or another youth or whatever to go on that trip than it is to give my time and to go and to spend a week. How many of you would say, you know, I'd rather write a check to pay somebody to be in the nursery, in a preschool area, than to go down there and to serve in the preschool area? And I will tell you this, I'll tell you what our preschool leaders would say. They would say, we appreciate the money, but we want you. And I think God would look at us and say the same thing. Appreciate the money, appreciate the fact that you're willing to give and that you want to give. But I want more than your checkbook. You know, this lady gave everything she had. How about you? Are you willing to give what you have? Whether it's your money, your time, your talents. Are you willing to give it all to Jesus? Because that's what he asked for. When we think about money, here's a couple of quotes. Martin Luther said this: I've tried to keep things in my hands and lost them all. But what I have given into God's hands, I still possess. And then C.S. Lewis says, I do not believe one can settle how much we ought to give. I am afraid the only safe rule is to give more than we can spare. I want to challenge you today to give more than you can spare. Whether that's of your money, whether that's of your time, whether that's of the talents that God has given you. I want to challenge you to ask yourself, where am I? Do I give myself, my talents, my money, do I give it so that people will recognize it? So that people will say, wow, man, that's a great person. I love the way they do all those things at church. Or do we give because it makes us feel good? And again, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong because giving, because it gives a good feeling back to us. Do we give out of our abundance? You know, do we look at our schedules and say, well, I got 15 extra hours in a week, well, I'll give one of those to church. You know, what God may be saying to you, instead of giving one to church out of your 15 extra hours, how about giving us 5 and giving the school or your community or somebody else, giving them another 5? It's giving to that point that challenges us. God wants to challenge you because the rewards for giving, they're not just temporary. The reward for giving because it feels good is temporary. The reward for giving out of our abundance is temporary. The reward for giving out of recognition is temporary. You experience it now. It feels good. It's fun to have people recognize you. It doesn't hurt. But the giving that is done out of pure devotion, out of giving our all to God, it goes way beyond anything temporary. Jesus says that we store up treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys, where thieves don't break in and steal. I love that verse because it tells me that Jesus says, be a hoarder. Be incredibly selfish. You're going, wait a second, Grant. Jesus would never tell me to be selfish. Yes, he does. Jesus tells you to be greedy. He says, store up. Hoard it. That word store, it's hoarded up. Hoard up treasures. But he says, just make sure when you're hoarding up the treasure, make sure where you're hoarding it up. Because if you're hoarding up your treasures for here, thieves break in and steal. Moths and rust destroys. The stock market tanks. And you see that great retirement nest egg dwindle. All of those things happen. And Jesus says, don't store your treasure. Don't be greedy for treasure for here. Be greedy for treasure in eternity. And as we give our lives, as we give ourselves to God, we are storing up treasures in heaven, the place that we are going to. So my challenge to you is, live your life in such a way that you are storing up treasures, that you are storing up your financial treasures, that you are storing up your time treasure, you're storing up your talent treasure, to store those up. And give as much as you absolutely can. But just make sure that you're giving it in such a way that it is a place that you're going to. Jesus tells us to be greedy. Here is a woman that from the face of it looks as if she is the complete opposite of greedy. But I think Jesus looked at her and said, there is a woman who understands treasure in heaven versus treasure here. And there's a woman who was greedy. And God smiled on her. Let's pray together. Father, I pray that you would help us to put our hearts in the right place. Father, that you would help us to come to that place in our life where we give everything that we are and everything that we have, that we give them to you, that we give them in such a way that we are storing up our treasures in heaven. Father, thank you for the story that you gave of this woman who gave those 2 small copper coins. Father, help us to follow in her footsteps, and that we would always invest our lives out of pure devotion for you, knowing that we will have a reward in eternity. Pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen. You know, we talked about